Hello again. I am, as I have freely confessed in the past, very far from being an expert in any particular field. One of the fields in which I'm not an expert is law, and international law in particular. Nor am I any sort of intellectual or academic. Whether these deficiencies handicap me in analysing modern society, I could not say. I was more than a little surprised yesterday to see that an attempt to deport 50 Jamaican criminals from Britain had to be halted at the last moment because of actions by human rights lawyers. I give a link to this case in the description to this video. 43 of the men were taken off the aeroplane at the last moment that was scheduled to return them to Jamaica. And the reason was to give them a chance to explain to the courts how their human rights were being breached. Among them were a murderer and a man who had raped a child. None of them had any right to be in Britain, and this is where I find myself getting a little confused. Perhaps viewers might be able to aid me and explain where my thought processes might be going wrong. Let's face it, one reaches a certain age and the brain does tend to slow down a bit, so perhaps that is the problem here. Most of the people who have been scheduled for deportation have come to Britain on standard visitor visas and then not left the country when these expired. I give a link above to the information on visas for Jamaicans visiting Britain. They may stay for 6 months at most and must then leave the country. This is quite clear and unambiguous. The men who were being deported had not left the country after 6 months and were therefore in Britain illegally. And this is the part that I find confusing. Let me indulge in a little personal reminiscence because perhaps things have changed in the last 40 or 50 years. I don't know. I don't do much travelling these days. 50 years ago, I used to move about quite a lot, mainly in the Middle East. Here's my old passport, and this is what I looked like in those days. Yeah, a lot darker than I am now. It's one of the advantages of having a touch of the tar brush in the family tree. Anyway, when I entered the country, I would be given a visa which told me how long I could stay in that country. Here's one for Syria. Yeah, right. It tells me in French that I have 14 days in Syria before I have to leave. Now, as it happens, I spent longer than that in Syria and did not officially leave the country in the end, but that's another story. If the Syrians had found that I was still there after a fortnight, they would have been irritated with me and either chucked me over the nearest border or perhaps even locked me up. If they'd got out of bed the wrong side that day, they might even have shot me. The question is, did I have a human right to overstay that visa? I knew how long I was allowed to stay. It's marked in the passport. It says 15 jours there, you see. No ambiguity there. Did I have a right to exceed that time? It's the same with all my visas. Here's Egypt, permission for 1 month. What else have we got? Oh yes. Here's Cyprus, permission for 3 months. And just below it, there's an Israeli visa, and it says, the holder of this permit is not permitted to work. Does anybody watching this seriously believe that I had a human right at that time to ignore the terms of those visas? That I could simply make Egypt or Cyprus my home and live there for good, despite only having been given a visa for a month or 3 months? Let me say right now that I have in the past, it's very wrong of me, I have disregarded the provisions of such visas and worked illegally. But I was never under the slightest doubt that I was breaking the law and that if I was not careful I would end up in prison or being deported. Again, I must ask, does anybody seriously believe for a moment that I had a human right to work in a country which had stamped in my passport the clear statement that the holder of this permit is not permitted to work? Really? Britain is rammed to the gunnels with people who have overstayed their visas and then embark on a life of crime into the bargain, and we are too tender-hearted to throw them out. Of course, it's possible that I've got myself into a muddle about this matter. I mean, am I missing something? Have things changed? Why don't the rules apply anymore? And why is it that other countries can act ruthlessly against illegal immigrants, but in Britain we cannot even remove a few dozen of the millions of people living here without any right to be in the country? I'll be very curious to know what people say about this.